Hi, my name's Tanya Gulliver Garcia, and I'm the Director of Learning and Partnerships at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Welcome to How Giving Circles Can Move the Needle on Disaster Philanthropy. CDP acknowledges that we are working from the stolen lands of Indigenous people. Philanthropy and other forms of oppression have contributed to that and have a role to play in helping to solve it. During today's session, I hope that you get an increased awareness of disaster funding trends and issues, including the needs and gaps in disaster giving. I hope that you can understand how COVID-19 and the increased pace of disasters have changed donors' thinking about disaster giving. And I hope that you get insight into strategies and best practices for disaster philanthropy that you as a Giving Circle member or administrator can apply to both new and existing opportunities. Does anyone feel like this? Certainly, I think all of the staff at CDP feel like this right now. Tornadoes, floods, fires, earthquakes, and the pending hurricane season, it's just too much. And it's definitely a lot for those nonprofit organizations that are trying to respond. And they're the ones that need our help so that they can influence what happens on the ground. So I want to tell you a little bit about CDP. Our mission is to mobilize philanthropy to strengthen the ability of communities to withstand disasters and recover equitably when they occur. We view ourselves as a philanthropic serving organization, which means that we're there to help you and others who need advice, guidance, resources, and want to learn more about how they can also move the needle on disasters. We do our work in three what we call buckets, and I love the word buckets because I think they all flow into each other. So the bucket that I spend most of my time working in is educational resources. This is all the material or most of the material that you see on our website. It's a network of disaster funders. It is a webinar series. It's research. It's information that we just hope helps you. We also have grant making and recovery funds. We're not an endowed foundation, so after every disaster and in between, we're raising dollars that we pool together to be able to respond. And in most cases, we're looking at long-term recovery, which means we're not giving out our funds until 6, 9, or even 12 months after a disaster. In fact, we just wrapped up our last Hurricane Harvey grant in November 2022. And then we also have consulting services, and this is where we provide guidance and support for corporations, foundations, individuals who want to determine what strategy would work best for them, or who want to find out what groups are responding on the ground after a specific disaster. As I mentioned, in the education, we have all sorts of resources, and we encourage you to check them out at disasterphilanthropy.org. Our Disaster Philanthropy Playbook is a detailed look. It includes toolkits and tip sheets and resources to help you think about how you want to make your disaster philanthropy work. We also have blogs, issue insights, disaster profiles, and a weekly disaster update that looks at all the disasters around the world that, if you're like me, you probably missed. We have a monthly webinar series. We have special research reports that come out on a regular basis, and our staff are always available to help with analysis, opinion, consulting services, and other speaking engagements. If you could use us, we're there for you. So let's talk about disasters. What is a disaster? CDP uses a modified version of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's definition, which talks about a disaster being a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or even broader society at any scale due to hazardous events that interact with vulnerability, capacity, and exposure. I want to point out that we don't use the word or the phrase natural disasters at CDP. We like to say natural hazards and extreme weather events. And that's because there's nothing really natural about a disaster. We're going to talk about climate change shortly, and climate change has definitely changed the face of disasters. But what we like to say, it's a bit of a math equation, but it's a super easy one. It's a natural hazard or extreme weather that adds to a pre-existing vulnerability, and that could be location, poverty, race, gender, age, and that equals the disaster. So natural hazard plus vulnerability equals disaster. This generally means the natural hazard is intersecting with people or with a population. We also look at complex humanitarian emergencies, and these are a type of disaster or sequence of events that are caused by more complicated circumstances. And I like to bring that into crisis, conflict, climate, and in the last few years, also COVID. I also want to talk about the disaster life cycle, because all disasters go through these, and in many ways, they're recurring constantly. I live in New Orleans, and we are almost 18 years past Hurricane Katrina, and yet we are still recovering and dealing with the impacts. I think most of us as funders have tended to look in that area in the beige kind of text. We look at response and relief, and in fact, most money goes out in the response and relief phase. What we don't look as much, and what CDP wants to really support, is helping to move you to strategic thinking. How can you look at mitigation, preparing to prevent the impact of future emergencies or minimizing their effects? How do you look at preparedness? And that includes planning, making individual or community preparations that will help them get the help that they need, and reconstruction and recovery. After all the groups go home, who's left on the ground, who's there helping, and how do we get those communities back, rebuilt, and hopefully even better than they were before? So I promised that we would talk about climate change. There is an extreme link between climate change and disasters, and in fact, climate change accounts for up to 90% of all disaster events. If you remember, that was one of the 4 C's in complex humanitarian emergencies as well: crisis, conflict, climate, and COVID. As climate change increases, we are seeing more and more disasters. And one of the things that we're starting to realize is there's no more seasons. Last year, California eliminated wildfire season because the wildfires were happening all year round. I think the number of tornadoes we've seen already in 2023 might mean we should look at eliminating tornado seasons. And we just had a subtropical, pre-tropical system in the Gulf. So maybe there's no hurricane season anymore. Disasters are not randomly distributed, the threat of a disaster. And as I mentioned, some of those groups that have pre-existing vulnerabilities, age, gender, sexual identification, both orientation and gender identification, disabilities, the housing conditions, rental status, all of these things are factors that can create and influence somebody's ability to recover from a disaster. One of the things that we've noticed is that those people that are most at risk, who have root cause issues that are causing them to suffer, maybe it's hunger, maybe it's a lack of access to transportation, also have the most risks after a disaster. And disasters generally just tend to devastate and expand those existing inequalities. And all disasters have a racial wealth gap impact. And white residents accumulate more wealth after a disaster, while residents of color accumulate less. The bigger the disaster, the bigger the impact. So how can giving circles advance climate justice? 1, fund more mitigation and preparedness at the local level. And I'm going to show you some stats about why that's so important after this. Build and strengthen relationships with nonprofits and first responders. Support something that's super underfunded: local coalitions, task forces, and cross-sectoral partnerships. Fund locally led adaptation, resilience, preparedness, and response programs. And listen and learn from your grantee partners and communities, and financially resource Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations. So let's talk about disaster philanthropy and the numbers. 80% or more of individual donations arrive within just days, usually about 5 or 6. It just depends on the kind of disaster. 80%. We create a report for the last 9 years that has looked at the measuring the state of disaster philanthropy. It's 2 years behind because we are looking at IRS data, and they are dreadfully behind right now. This is our taxonomy and the disaster assistance strategies that we look at. The strategies should look familiar to you because they're the same ones in the phases. The disaster taxonomy, again, similar: complex humanitarian emergencies, man-made accidents, which we didn't really talk about, but those are things like the train derailment in Palestine or the explosion in Beirut's harbor a few years ago. General in this category just means anything that didn't get classified somewhere else. And then the natural hazards and severe weather events that we talked about. Let's look at funding by disaster type. As you can remember, 2020 was a bit of an unusual year. And in that year, 96% of the funding went to epidemics. That is fairly unusual. Usually we're seeing the majority of the funding going to the natural hazards and severe weather events. Let's also take a look at this by disaster assistance strategy. Response and relief, again because of COVID, was 90% of the amount of money that was given out by philanthropy. Even though this looks really huge, and it is compared to previous years, the proportions are not all that different. Response and relief is always the biggest category, then followed usually by reconstruction and recovery at somewhere between 8, 10, 12%. It's still not very high. Preparedness, mitigation, risk, those usually come in at 2 or 3%. These are not big spending areas. Individual giving, and this is where you may be interested. We only capture a few different ones. We don't capture all of them. But Fidelity, one of our clients, $494 million given through their donor advised funds. Global Giving, $29 million. Candid's high net worth individuals, $5.8 billion. U.S. government aid also increased dramatically in 2020. And I'm going to show you a comparison of all these numbers shortly. So FEMA funding, $57.6 billion. Housing and Urban Development, $9 billion. And economic development, $1 billion. International government aid. This is where we see the complex humanitarian emergencies getting a little more money, and they typically do from international governments. That's because this is where the majority of funding comes from for complex humanitarian emergencies. It's not something that receives a lot of philanthropic dollars. And I know my head might be covering the 2020 box, but what I want you to see is the little red line across the bottom that shows that there is not very much of a difference when we take out the pandemic of the disaster trend, excluding epidemics, year over year over year. And believe me, behind my head, it's still a red straight line. It's a little bit of a comparison, as I promised. So Fidelity, $21 million in 2019 to $494 million in 2020. Their donors certainly stepped up. FEMA, $3 billion to $58 billion. That was all of the assistance that folks were getting for testing, government assistance, kits, everything else that they needed. We can provide a map that can help you watch and look at all of this data more carefully at disasterphilanthropy.candid.org. So what are the things that you can do? First, take the long view. Provide flexible, unrestricted funding and fund as locally as possible. Support the sharing of promising practices and collaboration. Bring people together so they can work together. And do that for yourselves as well. It's kind of the whole concept of a giving circle, but connect with other donors and funders, or look at funding funds when it doesn't make sense for you to make multiple small donations. Look to past disasters for guidance, and then don't forget to ask and trust the experts. Like I said, we're here for you at CDP.
So I want to thank you for listening. Hope you've made it this far. If you have any questions, you can reach me at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org.